I don't know if you can read the shirt or not, but down at the bottom of it, it says, can you read it? Faith, family, and then ducks. You see the book, and we showed it to you last week. Let me tell you just a little bit about Phil Robertson. Phil Robertson is a Louisiana Cajun, I guess you would say. He also, when he went to college, he went to Louisiana Tech, and he played football. And his backup quarterback his junior and sophomore year was none other than Terry Bradshaw. Anybody remember Terry Bradshaw? If you are an NFL football man, you know, what was it? He won four Super Bowls, the only quarterback to ever quarterback 4 of them. He was Phil Robertson's backup quarterback for 2 years. So he obviously, though he doesn't look like it here, at one time was a pretty good athlete. In fact, his junior year, now they didn't have a real good record because they played bigger schools and big teams. They even played Alabama in his junior year, and they got beat pretty solidly by Alabama at Alabama. But he passed for almost 300 yards, and it prompted Bear Bryant to say that he's one of the best I've ever seen. Now, that was quite a compliment, in spite of the fact that Phil Robertson said, I think he said he threw 3 interceptions that day. So he also had a lot that were received, but some of his passes were actually caught and received by the University of Alabama. But Phil, and he's written this book, and I just want to mention a couple of things to you. You'd wonder, why in the world would you maybe have a sermon based on that today and next week? But if you read this, this book, by the way, was published several years ago, and it was called at that time Legends of a Duck Commander. I doubt if too many people bought the book. Those that were duck hunters and maybe those who were hunters in general might have purchased it. But unless you've been living under a rock for the last couple of years, you've at least heard of Duck Dynasty. Am I right? Kind of do your heads like this. And if you've watched the show, in fact, they have set all kind of records for cable TV. More people have watched that show than any other nonfiction show on cable TV ever in the history. In fact, a week ago, Wednesday night, over almost 12 million people watched the episode where Phil Robertson and his wife actually got married. Now, they had been married, of course, about 50 years ago, not quite. But they went to a justice of the peace, so their children gave them a wedding ceremony. But at any rate, they republished this book, and they called it Happy, Happy, Happy. And the last time I checked, it was #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list. So it's amazing what a little notoriety will do to you if you want to write a book, isn't it? But you look at it, some of the titles of the chapters are very intriguing. The very first one, for living happy, 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 says simplify your life. Chapter number 2 is don't let your children grow up to be nerds. A lot of good practical advice. But then you get over to the last 3 chapters in the book. Chapter 12 is entitled The Prodigal Son. Guess what that's about? Chapter 13, he calls it River Rats. Now, some of you live down by the river, but we won't go there. Basically, that chapter is about sharing the Word of God, and chapter 14 is about reading the Bible. And one of the things he says it's not too late to change and to save this country from the direction that it's going down. But I thought it prompted the question, at least, happy, happy, happy. Does God promise us happiness? Does He promise you that you will be happy? Does He want us to be happy? Does He want us to be joy-filled? And if so, is there any part in that we play? Proverbs chapter 23 and in verse number 7, in Proverbs, by the way, let me just kind of preface what I'm going to say. When we look at these scriptures, while this scripture is true, it is not an absolute truth. He says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. This is the New King James translation. Now, while that's true, that's not absolutely true. Solomon is not saying that whatever a man thinks, then he's going to be able to do it. See, now, as a former basketball coach, I used to tell my players, whatever the mind can see and believe, it can achieve. Somebody said it. It's okay. If you can see it and believe it, you can achieve it. Let me tell you something. Anybody in here believe I can dunk a basketball? Oh, come on. It is a joke. When I was a senior in high school, I weighed considerably less than what I do now. I was the same height then. In fact, I was probably a little bit taller. Probably, you begin to shrink a little as you get older. Things settle in. But even then, I could barely touch the basketball goal. They made a movie about me, right? Any of you see the movie? Yeah, White Men Can't Jump. They made that about me. Now, see, I might be able to convince myself that I could dunk a basketball, but that doesn't mean I could dunk it. See, so that's put that disclaimer in it. However, he says, as he thinks in his heart, so is he. Now, Jesus said something similar to that over in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 34. He said, for out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Now, if you go back to the Proverbs passage, and I'm not asking them to turn back there to it, but if you look back at Proverbs, the reason Solomon said that, the context was in regard to sitting down at a rich man's table to eat, and then to sit down and to eat with somebody who is stingy and selfish and wants to hoard things for themselves. The writer said, don't sit down and eat at his table, because his mouth may tell you eat and drink and be filled, but his heart doesn't want you to have anything. And what Jesus is saying is, what we say, and we might add what we do, is really nothing more than a reflection of what we are on the inside. So can I control? There are certain things, yes. We all have the ability and the power inside of us to be and to become what God wants us to become. Now, Paul said it a little differently. He said in Philippians 4:13, I can do everything through Christ who strengthens me. Now, there again is that statement. While that's a true statement, it's not an absolute truth. I cannot do and accomplish every single thing that I want to do, but I can with the help of God. I can do all things. And whatever I'm able to do, I will do it through Him. Now, what about regarding being happy? You said, preacher, let me tell you, if you walked in my shoes, you wouldn't be smiling all the time. And you know what? You may be right. The old saying, I think it was the Indians who had a saying, don't judge me until you've walked a mile in my shoes. I understand that. We all have different circumstances. The question is, do they define us? And do they cause us to be what we are? In the book of Philippians, we looked there at chapter 4. If you look in chapter 1 and in verse number 18, Paul said, but what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether they're false motives of true, Christ is preached, and because of this I rejoice. And yet I will continue to rejoice. Let me just read 3 or 4 passages from Philippians. In the 2nd chapter, verse 17, he said, even if I'm poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and I will rejoice. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. And then in chapter 3 and in verse 1, he said, my brothers, rejoice. In chapter 4, he says, rejoice in the Lord always. And then he says, let me say it again, rejoice. Somebody tell me, where was Paul when he wrote the book of Philippians? I hear several of you say, let's say it together. The answer is prison. Where was Paul when he wrote Philippians? Prison. And yet he's talking about rejoicing. Now, in a way, happiness and rejoicing, they're not equal. They're not necessarily the same thing, but they embody the same thing. How in the world could a person be in jail? In fact, if you go back to that first chapter in Philippians when Paul is there, he's talking about people who are actually trying to bring trouble on him and present some problems to him because they're jealous of his preaching and his teaching. And yet he says, I still rejoice because Jesus is being preached. See? Even though he's in prison, even though he's in jail, yes. Psalms 118, the psalmist said, "This is the day the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it." Now, when I read that, I don't believe it says, "This is the day that the Lord has made. And if it's beautiful outside and the temperature's not too hot and not too cold, and if everything's going just like I want it to be, I will rejoice and be glad in it." Do you understand what I'm saying? I may not be in the best set of circumstances, and that's what Phil is saying in his book, Happy, Happy, Happy. But I can rejoice and be glad in it. Even in circumstances that I really don't want to be in, yes. Once when Paul was over in Philippi, he was arrested, he and Silas, and they were thrown in prison, thrown in jail. And at midnight, what were they doing? Praising God and singing. They were in bonds, they were in stocks, and they were in prison, and yet he was rejoicing. See, our circumstances don't have to define us. We can be happy now. Are you ready? Oh, the time to be happy is now. Come on. And the place to be happy is. And the way to be happy is to. And we'll have a little heaven down here. And we really can. You see, one of the points that I'm trying to get across is that we can determine, while we can't determine all of our circumstances and we can't determine all the things that life gives us, we can make a determination of how we react to them. And that makes all the difference in the world. Actually, the mind is an amazing thing. I read a book a number of years ago entitled Mind Control by Jon Silva. Anybody in here ever heard of the book or read it before? Actually, Paul Torrance, and you've heard Joe mention Paul's name. He says he's one of his mentors years ago down in Montgomery, Alabama. Gave me a copy of that book when I was coaching basketball. In that book, Jon Silva talked about literally taking a razor blade and barely slicing his skin on his hand and let you see the blood come out and you see the separation, and then his brain would tell his body to send signals down and to close that wound up and heal it. And actually, in a matter of moments, it would be closed. I asked Paul Torrance, I said, "Paul, did that really happen?" He said, "Yeah. They verified it." The mind is an amazing thing. Have you ever seen pictures of people walking on hot coals? Ever seen those? I can remember watching some of them watch like similar to what you're looking at right now, and I thought, oh, there's just no way. There's got to be some trick to that, right? Now, it looks to me like he's not walking but running. And he probably is. Wouldn't you be? Yeah, I would. I don't think they want you to stand there too long on examining those coals. And we've got a few other pictures. Let me just show you here where people, there's Miss Oprah walking on those hot coals. And I see that, and we can go ahead. And while you're looking at those pictures, our youngest son, Tom, and his wife, Michelle, here in town that have the Front Porch Ministry, one of the men on the board told him, he said, "Tom, you really need to go to Tony Robbins' seminar. If I can make arrangements for you and Michelle to go and take care of everything, will you all get a babysitter for your kids, and will you go?" And they said yes. When he came back, he couldn't wait to tell me. He said, "Dad, I walked on the hot coals." I said, "You did what?" He said, "I walked on the hot coals." And in the last couple of weeks, I've just gone back and asked him questions about that. And in reality, they spent 6 or 8 hours in seminars that day, and he was preparing their minds. And in essence, in a way, I guess, of putting yourself in kind of a semi-trance, literally walked across the coals. Now, he said the ones that they walked on, that looks like maybe it's 10 or 12 feet long. A lot wider than that. He said they had 10 of them out because there were 3,000 people the night he went to the seminar that chose to walk on the hot coals. Now, you prepare the mind, and they were able to do it, and yet I said, and it didn't burn your feet. He said, no. He said, now I tell you, he's smarter than he looks. He let his wife go ahead of him. See, we didn't raise no dummy. And he said, but you know what? Watching other people walking ahead of me, and even watching Michelle and knowing that she wasn't writhing in pain and hollering out, I began to wonder. Those negative thoughts came. Are my feet going to burn? Is it going to burn me? And you got to get that out of your mind. And he said, they tell you, don't look down at the coals, look straight ahead. It's kind of like if you're up on something high. You know, I can stand here on this step, and I'm not too afraid of falling because it's not very far. But if this were 20 or 30 feet off, I would be a little more careful, right? Well, they say, don't look down, just look ahead. Keep your eyes on Jesus. By the way, Tony Robbins in that seminar told the people, now when I do this, I think of Jesus Christ because I'm a Christian. And he said, I can do all things through him that strengthens me. See, I just appreciate people who use opportunities to share their faith. Thoughts. Here's the point. Thoughts become things. That part it's well worth remembering. Years ago, I read a book entitled Acres of Diamonds. Anybody in here read that book besides me? Anybody? I see one or two hands. Any of you heard of the book before besides that? Just two or three, four, okay, a few of you. It's written by, if I remember correctly, Dr. Russell Conwell, and he lived back in the 1800s. I think he died in the early 1900s. But he wrote the book, and he said that someone told him this story, and he said it was a true story, and he was able to verify it. Now, I'll just have to go on that basis. But there were traveling priests back at this time in the country where he was that would travel through places, and they would work in an area and find a home to stay in, and then they'd move on to another area. And a priest came, and he stayed in this farmer's house, and he didn't have a whole lot. He had some land, not a lot of land, but he had some land, but he was happy as a lark. But the priest told him about diamonds. And he said, oh man, if you could find diamonds, you not only would have everything you got now, but then you'd have wealth and you'd be able to do so many other things. Well, now then, all of a sudden, instead of being happy and content, he was unhappy. And according to the story, he sold his farm, made a decision, moved his family in with some other people to live, and he took off in search of finding diamonds. A few years later, all of his money gone. He died an untimely death. The person that purchased his farm, in a river, a stream that ran through the property, he noticed a glistening, and it became one of the largest diamond mine finds in the history of the world up to that point in time. You see, he had what he wanted so desperately, but he couldn't see it. He thought it was somewhere else. Unfortunately, sometimes we think the things that are going to make us happy or the things that are going to satisfy us is out here just beyond our grasp and just beyond our reach. And what Dr. Conwell was trying to get us to understand in that book, Acres of Diamonds, is that we may have it right within us. All we have to do is to draw on it. You understand what he's saying? Thoughts become things. Before there was a telephone, there was one in the mind of Alexander Graham Bell. Before there were ever light bulbs that illuminated a dark room, there was one in the mind of Thomas Edison. How many times did he try and fail? Thoughts become things. Before there ever became an assembly line to build automobiles, there was one in the mind of Henry Ford. Before there were ever machineries that would go out and help farmers to farm lands and do it so much quicker, a harvester of some kind, there was one in the mind of a man by the name of McCormick. Thoughts can become things, and that's why Solomon said, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. We can literally change our plot in life by our own thought processes with the help of God. And I want to challenge us to do that. I don't know what all is in your heart and mind right now. I don't know. I don't know the struggles that you're going through. See, I look over here at David McVeigh, and he's with us today, and it's so thrilling. David looks better than I've seen him in quite a while. And he's got a tough plot in life. But David, you see, David has contentment inside of him. And the joy that Paul talks about, rejoicing in the Lord, the ability to be able to rejoice even though you're in prison, the ability to be able to rejoice no matter what is happening to you in life. It's a decision that you and I can make. Sometimes, history will show this, that some people succeed even in the worst of times. In fact, some people that have become the wealthiest people in the world did so in times of depression. Other people don't succeed in the very best of times. And you know what? Sometimes it is so easy to blame everybody else for all of our mistakes. Oh, those of you that are younger, please hear this. It's so easy to blame the parents. It's so easy to blame the teacher. It's so easy to blame the coach. It's so easy to blame the government. It's so easy to blame everybody else. Now, does that mean those circumstances don't have something to do? No, they do. But it doesn't have to define us. And it doesn't have to restrict us. Period. Do some people have better parents than others? Do your heads like this? Do some people have better teachers? Taylor's jumping up and down. Some people have much better dads. But you see, they don't have to limit what we're actually capable of doing. Sometimes, there's some people that are bent toward the negative side instead of the positive side. Am I right? Sometimes there are people that say, I'll tell you, I just believe you ought to say what you believe, and I do. I don't hold anything, but I'll tell you exactly how I feel. I'm not going to lie about it. Well, bless your heart. I think the Lord said something like, don't offend in word or deed. We can learn to tell the truth without necessarily being offensive. We can change our personality. Now, that's not easy to do, but we can. Ben Franklin has gone down in history as one of the greatest ambassadors this country has ever had. And yet at one time, Ben Franklin said he was losing more friends than he was gaining new ones. And he said, I need to change. And he did. And he became one of the greatest ambassadors this country's ever had. We can choose our personality. Let me tell you, one of the points I'm trying to make with this happiness thing and being happy or being joyful. Let me tell you about how many of you, some of you probably remember the name Robert Schuller, a preacher from days gone by, and I think, is he still alive and still preaching? He wrote a book that I read back in the 70s. And I was reading that book, and in it he told the story of his daughter. And here was the point. One of his main points that he's tried to get across when he goes around speaking, and he's a minister or was a minister in California. I don't know if he's alive or dead. But he had a 13-year-old daughter. And one of the points he's trying to make when he would speak is, listen, focus on what's left and not on what's been lost. It's amazing what that can do. Once he was out of the country, he and his wife on a speaking engagement, and while they were gone, they got a telephone call because their daughter, who was 13 at the time, had gotten on a motorcycle with a friend of hers, and there had been a wreck, and she was in the hospital. They jumped on the first plane they could get, came back to the States, went into the hospital. They talked to the nurses, and I think even a doctor before going in, and they found out that they had to amputate one of her legs. And her dad, and she was writing and saying, what in the world am I going to say? And they stood beside her bed. She was asleep when they first went in, and they stood there and waited, and she eventually woke up, and when she woke up and she looked up and saw them, she started smiling. And before her dad could say anything, she looked up at him and she said, Dad, like you always say, focus on what's left and not on what's been lost. When her leg healed sufficiently, she got an artificial leg, and she loved playing softball, and she got out and she continued to play softball. Oh, was she restricted some? Oh, you know she was. But she chose to focus on what was left and not what had been lost. The year's 1948, and we're at the Olympics, and there's a young Hungarian lad, and he has a pistol in his right hand. And he's aiming at a target some distance away, and he takes that finger and he pulls it slowly 100 times, and the bullet hits the bullseye dead center. And they play the national anthem from his country as they put the gold medal around his head. When he goes back home, his country is in a military conflict, and they send him into war. He trips over a mine, and the explosion takes his right arm. The year's 1952. The Olympics are there. There's another Hungarian lad, though, that's competing this year, but he only has one arm. This time the pistol's in the left hand. And again, he aims it at the target and gently squeezes the trigger. And again, the bullet hits the bullseye dead center. And he walks away with his second gold medal. Oh, it would have been so easy to say, look what life did to me. Look what those sorry, and call the country that had invaded their country. I was a great shooter. I could have won another gold medal. But rather he chose to think and say, I still have my keen eyesight. He focused on what he still had. I still have a steady hand. I've just got to train my left hand to do what previously my right hand had done. It's amazing what the body can do and what we can do. One other story. A lady by the name of Shelley Mann. You probably have never heard of her. But Shelley Mann, the first time her mother took her to the swimming pool, it wasn't to swim. It was just in hopes that she would be able to move some of the muscles in her body, because as a young child she had contracted, I guess I should, whatever the word is, polio. And she was able to move some of the muscles. Eventually, they began to teach her some swimming strokes. And she says, I remember the day that I was able to swim the width of the pool just one time. When I reached the other side, she said, I was so excited, I cried. And she said, I remember the day that I swam the length of the pool. When I touched the end on the deep end, I cried again. Fast forward some years later, she's standing on a platform. And they're playing the national anthem because she has won the gold medal in the butterfly swim. During her career, she set 8 American records in swimming. It didn't define her. Did she have to work harder than others? Yes, you know she did. But she didn't let her circumstances define her. Folks, God has said that we can rejoice even if the circumstances are not what we want them to be. I would not want to be in stocks and in a prison down on a concrete or dirt floor. But Paul said, I rejoice, and I want you to rejoice for me, because that's where I am. Jesus said, I came that you might have life and you might have it abundantly. If somebody gives you lemons, we make lemonade. Easy? Not always, no. Hard? Most of the time. Difficult? Many times. But Jesus said, I offer you the peace that passeth all understanding. no matter what plot you have in life. Right, David? The peace that passeth all understanding. Because of whose we belong to. It makes all the difference in the world. Happy, happy, happy. Yeah, we can be. Even if you wear a silly t-shirt like this to preach in. God loves us. He wants us to love Him. And He wants us to love other people as much as He has loved us. Oh, what a blessing. Young people, you can do anything you want to do. God being your helper, you can accomplish everything you want to accomplish with the help of God. Don't let anybody tell you any different. Period. And you know, if you shoot for the moon, but you only get up 200,000 feet, just how much higher did you get? It's all in the state of mind. The time to be happy is now. I don't know. What's the song we're singing, Terry?
What a friend we have in Jesus.
I'm sorry?
What a friend we have in Jesus.
What a friend we have in Jesus. Hey, we're going to end today a little differently than normal. And I'm sorry I didn't tell Terry this ahead of time. But he and his group can adjust. They make me adjust. I'm going to ask you to just where you are just to sit. And I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. And you can go ahead and close them now. And I don't know what it is in life right now. But I agree with Rick Warren. He said, you know, almost all the time in life, life is like a railroad track. Even when something great is going on, there's generally something else going on that's not so great in the same life. But whatever that is, if there's something you need to just turn loose and give to the Lord, then I want you to ask Him to take it. If there's something in your life that you need to change so that it will enhance and improve the lives of others around you, ask God to help change you. Sometimes one person in a family make everybody else in the family miserable. Maybe someone is making you miserable. Maybe you're the one making others miserable. It doesn't have to be that way. We can change. We can be what God has called us to be. We're going to sing this song, and you pray, and you talk right now. Go ahead, Tim.
What